Launching his presidential bid earlier today. For more tonight on candidate Sharpton, we are joined by two who know him and have covered him. Mort Zuckerman, Chairman, Editor-in-Chief of U.S. News and World Report, also publisher of the New York Daily News. And Charisse Jones is national correspondent for USA Today. She covered Mr. Sharpton back in her days at the New York Times. Charisse Jones, when a candidate like this steps forward, who in the polls and by all rational measure has an infinitesimal chance of getting elected president, the natural question becomes, what's he in it for? A, do you think that's fair? B, what do you think the answer is?
Well, I think that he steps into it because he has a chance to really shape the debate. I mean, I think it's true that he has a very small chance of being the Democratic nominee, but he has the opportunity to force the other candidates to address issues that are very important to his constituents, whether it's affirmative action or expanding health care or getting people to stop talking about war in Iraq. So it gives him a chance to be at the table, to play a role at the convention in 2004, and to heighten his profile nationally.
More. What do you know about the relationship between Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson? So much has been said about it over the years.
Well, it's a relationship of mentor and protege. I mean, I've actually gone out with the two of them when I've done stories on Reverend Sharpton. I think there's a lot of respect. I think that he's following in the tradition of Reverend Jackson and moving from street activism to mainstream politics. So I think he very much models himself after Reverend Jackson and Adam Clayton Powell and others before him in this evolution that he's had in his public persona.
And Charisse, do you think this whole campaign will give the Democrats a conundrum at their convention, how to handle Al Sharpton?
Well, I think they're going to have to deal with him, but they've been dealing with him for the last few years. I mean, this is a man that Hillary Clinton went to go see when he was in jail after, because of his activities on Vieques, and many people pay homage to him, and he raises a lot of issues that are important to a lot of people, that are important to the Democratic Party. So they're going to have to deal with him if they want the voter base he brings in.
This week alone, we've heard of at least 2 cases of teachers accused of having sex with their students. While many of the cases involve female teachers like Mary Kay Letourneau or Pamela Turner, this week's case in Georgia, as you saw, involves a male teacher. So should Carlton Calhoun expect to be treated any differently by the justice system? With us from New York is Charisse Jones. She's with USA Today. Good to have you, Charisse.
Thank you.
So the good news is there seems to be a greater awareness about these cases from the very fact that people are coming forward. But incidents between female teachers and male students seem to be viewed less seriously than those involving grown men and girls. Why is that?
Well, there's a double standard in our society. I mean, women sex offenders are often viewed as being mentally ill, and so they're more often referred for counseling, whereas a man is looked upon as being a predator, and it's thought that he has to have prison time as well as have treatment in a sex offender program. Also, with boys, people still think that it's kind of a conquest if he gets involved with an older woman, when it's really a very serious crime with damaging effects.
Well, sometimes behind stereotypes, I hate to admit it, but there's an element of truth. Could it be that these male students are less traumatized by their female teachers than vice versa, or is that complete nonsense?
It's nonsense to a large extent. Boys suffer some of the same effects as girl victims, whether it's anxiety or depression or difficulty forming healthy relationships in the future with the opposite sex, sexual problems. I mean, there are some people as individuals who can get over a trauma like this, but in general, it's devastating for boys as well as girls.
And it's interesting because as far as the teachers are concerned, it does seem that with these female teachers, when we have guests on, we're talking about their psychological problems that the teachers might be having, whereas with male teachers, it seems more violent somehow. At least that's the public perception.
Right. Well, the idea is that you have to punish a man, whereas the woman needs help. And some of that's perpetuated by the media. I mean, when you think about Desperate Housewives, you have a character who's involved with a teenage boy. I mean, if that was reversed, the storyline would be one of abuse. Instead, it's looked upon as being kind of titillating and okay, and how he's being initiated into this adult world.
Which is a great point. Do you think that Hollywood is actually perpetuating some of these teachers doing these offenses to students, or is that ridiculous to think that people would get ideas from TV?
I don't think they get ideas from TV, but I think the media reflects society's idea that boys are less traumatized and therefore the crime is less heinous when it involves young men, which is just not true.
Well, whatever the explanation, that perception does exist, and your article today really encapsulates it very well. Charisse Jones, thanks so much for joining us today. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
And much more ahead as we go inside our top story.
USA Today national correspondent Charisse Jones and clinical psychologist Kumeya Shorter-Gooden have studied 400 African-American women of all ages and social-economic backgrounds to learn what it's really like to be African-American and female. Now their research is revealed in a new book called Shifting: The Double Lives of Black Women in America.
You might feel that you have to take the braids out of your hair or the dreadlocks, so that the employer doesn't make a judgment about you based on your hair and think your politics are a certain way or your personality is a certain way.
You're not just talking about hairstyle, you're talking also about basically, you write, shifting has become an integral part of black women's behavior that some adopt an alternate pose or voice as easily as they blink their eyes or draw a breath.
A new shift in our repertoire is many black women now feel the need to be thinner. So as we integrate and assimilate into mainstream society, we feel more pressure to reflect the mainstream ideal. So you see over-dieting, over-exercising, more susceptibility to anorexia and bulimia.
With the behavioral questions, not the eating disorder, but with the behavioral questions, Charisse, do you shift?
I shift. I became aware of my shifting in doing this book, that I often shift between voices. And I remember on one occasion I was speaking in my more informal voice around a white colleague, and she mimicked me. And after she mimicked me, I felt very self-conscious, and I really worried that her image of me was now going to change, and she would feel that I was less intelligent or less capable because I made the mistake of speaking in my less formal voice in front of her.
Okay. Ms. Jones, you know, in your book, one of the things I found really kind of interesting and even moving, and I think it really did kind of, I think, perhaps you identified one of the things that creates this sense of backlash, when you talked about how difficult it is sometimes for black women in particular, since that's sort of what your book is mostly about, to navigate between a work world where sometimes they're isolated and it's sometimes a predominantly white world, and then coming back to the black community and having to manage sort of the codes of the black community at the same time. And this crushing burden of responsibility that black women feel, where they have to achieve beyond, you know, what would be normally expected just because they have to get over people's myths of black inferiority. And I was reminded of that when Professor Dyson sent me a piece that was from the LA Times, which was actually a review of his book. But what's interesting is it opened up with the writer talking about who teaches a poetry workshop, where she stops at a gas station, switches on, almost unthinkingly, she says, to a grim face because some young black men are loitering near the pumps. This is a black writer. Men who resemble the boys I just left, and looking hard at me, and caught between ethnic fear and familiarity, I go with fear. I learn early that I must survive first and reason later. Back on the road, a black motorist in a gleaming SUV has rap music, foul language and all, turned up to a deafening assault, shivering everything within a 4-lane radius from the tires up. I flash on a well-worn anger. Why we gotta be like this? On the way into Hollywood, I notice that almost every homeless person I pass is black, and the anger flares again, this time with more sorrowful indignation than exasperation. Why we gotta be like this? And so do you think that part of the backlash might come from the fact that this burden of having to overcome the myth of inferiority is the burden of overcoming a myth that's actually being reinforced in some ways, perhaps, in the public space?
I think there's a real effort to distance ourselves from those who are not doing as well, because we're trying so hard in these corporate corridors of power to make them forget that we are supposedly different. We're trying to prove ourselves every day, working extra hard to prove we're not a token, that we do deserve to be there, that we're competent. But I think that anyone who wants to renounce blackness only needs to look at Oprah Winfrey and what happened in Paris at Hermes, or David Dinkins or Danny Glover, who can't get a cab in New York City, to be reminded that no matter how successful you are, or educated or affluent, you are still dogged by the same stereotypes and misperceptions that dog the brother on the corner, or the 16-year-old girl who drops out of high school because she's pregnant. I mean, most of us in the middle class are a layoff away from being in bad financial straits ourselves. So, you know, I think it really behooves us, if we're not motivated by a sense of community, than to be motivated by a sense of self-preservation to fight for and create the kinds of institutions and systems that we might need one day, whether it's better public schools or universal health care or child care subsidies. And even if we don't need to tap into that now, our less fortunate brothers and sisters could benefit from those institutions being strengthened and sustained.
Mm-hmm. Now,